Hello, welcome to my third video. We're going to keep counting because I'm working on the consistency and just knowing how far I'm going just makes me it excites me knowing this is my third video already. So welcome, and today we're going to discuss something that I've been thinking about for a very long time, and it also happens to be one of my favorite things because I love reading and I love research. So we're going to, and so this required me to read a lot and research a lot, and that is the history of natural hair care in Kenya. And oh my god, there's a lot of resources on the history of hair care for black women all over, and while there's a lot of similarities, I feel like the Kenyan case is quite unique because we have our own way of doing things. Like somebody famously said, I can't remember who, I think it was Michael Joseph, the first Safaricom CEO, he said that Kenyans have peculiar habits, and we do. So I felt like we deserve to have our own, just a compiled history of hair care, and it would also help us understand just why we are the way we are, why we are where we are when it comes to natural hair acceptance and that kind of thing. Yeah? So I just thought I'd do this. So I'm going to start in a bit. I have divided this, the history into three parts. Where we have the pre-colonial, which was before the 1900s. I do not know exactly when, give or take, when the British actually made us a colony, but I just said 1900 below because I feel like until then people are still doing basically what they did. They just ignored the visitors and kept caring for their hair the way they were. There wasn't much influence from outside sources. Then we have the colonial period, which was 1900s to the 1960s, and then we have the post-independence period, which now I divided into the decades, the 60s, the 70s, the 80s, because the hairstyles were changing, the hair care was changing and changing very fast. Don't mind if I keep looking down, I'm reading my notes, so you have to just bear with me. So pre-colonial period, I had to go through like so many pictures. Luckily, like there's a lot of documentation, photographic documentation of how people lived, how culturally we dress and that kind of thing, and they exist, and if you take time you look and see them. And the one thing I noticed that was very different when it comes to Kenya, when you look at those photos from around that time, 1900s or around there, and what happens is the early 1900s, just at the time of the century, was long hair wasn't a standard for most tribes in Kenya. Long hair wasn't a standard for most parts of Kenya, so we had hairstyles, especially for women, we had hairstyles that were either short or clean shaven. And so hair care wasn't, like a very, I know there was maybe ochre, the use of ochre, the use of ghee, the use of fat from sheep and cows, but mainly hair care, long hair was kept by men, Morans at a certain stage in life, and it wasn't very, like for women, long hair wasn't a standard. In some parts of Kenya, there seems to have been, like cornrows, women wore cornrows along the coast, and then there was, where towards the north, and I also saw some people grew a bit of hair, and in Turkana also, where they did some twists here and there, in the middle shaved some parts and kept it, and others where people just let their cows free, like the parts where we border Somalia and that kind of thing. So there was mainly, so the main styles were either clean shaven. So the main hair care was shaving or shaving in interesting styles, maybe twisting with ochre, applying the fat from cows or sheep or goats, and also ghee and clay, applying some clays, maybe some oil. There was, I know some tribes actually made castor oil, but I'm not so sure. I didn't read that much about the uses of castor oil, but I did read about the use of the fats from the animal products on hair. And the most tribes kept, for the women, the long hair wasn't a standard, so hair care was mainly shaving. Not to say that hair wasn't important, because when you look at the rites around, the hair was part of the culture. It was a big part on the rites of passage, right? You're going from one stage to the next, or you got married, or you lost somebody, or you grew from childhood to adult. There was like shaving or changing the style, that kind of thing. So the main thing was the hair care was shaving or using the animal products to do the twist, and clay to do the twists and curls. And then there was the twists or small braids like the Morans had, and mainly it was men. Sometimes there are some regions where women could also do it, but for the most part women just had short hair. And I feel like that's the very peculiar thing about Kenya, because I was looking at about the region that we now call Kenya, because when you look at pictures and the documents from way back from other areas, even around Africa, there's a bit of a difference, because some other parts, not all of them, but some other parts you find, like when you go to South Africa and Congo, Ethiopia, where long hair was something many cultures there already practiced. They kept long hair, Chad, wherever. They had long hair care practices to grow hair, to keep it long, to maintain it long. They didn't really shave. So long hair, whatever version it was, whether it was twisted or just loose or braided or what, was like a beauty standard in that side. But here, for the most, it was you shave your hair or cut it or keep it short, and then just wear a lot of adornments, which we'll talk about some other day. Okay, so that is the pre-colonial period. Hair was important, but hair care was animal products, and mainly it was short hair care or bald hair. And then for women, and then for men it was long. Now in the colonial period, a lot changed. Looking at where we come from, within Kenya, most tribes just didn't do a lot with their hair. Along the coast maybe, and like I said in the north, but a lot for women. Women didn't grow their hair. Our ancestors weren't like growing hair, plaiting it, maybe they were busy farming or something. So during colonial period, with the coming of the British and Kenya becoming a colony, a lot changed when it comes to hair care. The changes already started, because all of a sudden there are influences from outside. Like even the British didn't just come alone; they came with other groups that came to work for them. The Indians, they came with the Nubians, they came with the Somalis, and also there was a lot more movement as the colony started taking shape, and this brought influences on hair care for the tribes and the people that were living here as Kenyans. So all of a sudden there were more options, that the see people. So the Indian influence didn't influence hair care as such. I feel like they influenced the cuisine eventually, because most of what we claim as Kenyan food is actually chapati, samosa, has roots in Indian cuisine also. But I digress. Let me go back. So the Indians didn't have as much influence on hair care at the time, at least, on the way Kenyans, or the people that now became Kenyans, were looking after their hair at the time. So, but there was other groups like the Somalis too, not too much. But then we had the Nubians, who look a lot like the typical Kenyans look like. So most of the people noticed that, and they had the same hair types more or less, or close at least. So they heavily influenced how the Kenyan women were looking after their hair, the women in the colonial period, especially early colonial period, because they started noticing, the Nubians were plaiting, and where now many cultures, some people were still, are coming from a place where there's short hair, everybody kept short hair or cut it off and wore. And so when they were taking off those garments and now kind of starting on the modernity journey, then the next thing they did was they started doing the braids and the cornrows like the Nubians, styling their hair a lot like the Nubians. And but then it's very interesting, because I noticed that in some places, like if you want to have somebody do for you the very tiny, nice, neat lines, like it's still Nubians that do it. So it's very interesting to me, but they had a heavy influence on the way we style our hair actually, because I believe, and I could be wrong, it could be because we have similar hair types, so, and we look a lot alike. Like we look a lot more closer physically than say the Indians or the white, the British people, or the Somalis even. So you'd feel, oh, this looks, you know, I don't know, I'm just thinking maybe that was the thinking, but they had a heavy influence. And that's where the braids, the twist, the lines, what we call lines, the schoolgirl lines, the pushback lines, just matuta styles started, you know, being a thing and started coming in and being quite a thing. There are other cultures that are already doing it, like the people from the coast, certain people from the coast, but it just, within the interior of Kenya, this kind of picked up from the Nubians, because the coastal people didn't really move upward. Okay, so they picked up from the Nubians, and that influenced greatly, and that's a game changer, because today that's one of the most popular hairstyles in Kenya, for natural hair, in schools, for children. It's just really popular underneath wigs. So yeah, so they influenced that, so there was a lot of cornrows and a lot of matutas, and those styles at the early colonial period. So hair involved, you know, plating, maybe preparing it and plating, some few combs here and there, and then having it plated. And as at the same time, so in this colonial period, depending on the time, early colonial period, we still had a lot of carryover from the pre-colonial. There's a lot of people that still stuck to what they used to do before the coming of the white man, before Kenya became a colony. And then there's others that had now come adopted the styles from the Nubians, and a few were even a bit ahead and had started, you know, maybe wrapping, tying silk scarves, which now you'll see as you go more into the colonial period, the scarves become a serious status symbol. It becomes very serious. I remember my great grandmother loved, and she was over 100 when she died, and so of course she was alive at that time, and she valued and treasured scarves, and she was telling me like a headscarf was such an important thing. And she used to tell me they used to, you know, it was very hard to get one, and once you got one, you were very stylish when she was a very young girl. So they just, you know, covered, so the hair care, you just didn't really do much. You just maybe washed your hair, you washed your body, you washed your head, maybe cut your hair with some scissors, and you wore your scarf. So from there, so there's this period in the 20s, maybe or 30s, where there was, you know, just a mix of all those things going on. But then going forward towards as we went deeper into that, like later into the colonial period in the 40s, 50s, now there's a bit of a shift, because there's a lot of influence also from the British style from Britain, like the wearing hats, you know, what the ladies were wearing. So the people who also aspired to be seen as a lady or modern, or, you know, people who had already gone to school by then, ladies were coming back, who had interacted with modernity, had chosen now, like, they would also wear hats, they'd also brush out, comb out their hair, comb it out and style it. So just style it, do styles, but when the hair is purely natural, you're still not processed, not processed at all, just style the natural hair in all sorts of styles. So that had become also a thing in the 50s, you know, 40s, 50s, and also there was headscarf, tying with scarves. Scarves were a big thing, and hats. There are so many different it was a very busy time, and also there are still some people still wearing their hair in the old traditional ways, which was basically just cut short, and then in between there are also these people with the braids and the lines. Now, so around there, it's also important to mention that towards the end, in the 50s, I think 40s, when the Mau Mau went to the forest and the struggle started in earnest, that actually had an impact on natural hair care, because they started a movement that later became like a whole thing. You know, they started with the locks. They introduced something, an element which, you know, wasn't so common. They just went into the forest and said they'll never cut their hair. And while most Mau Mau were men, there were women like Muthoni. Well, she just recently passed away, and I'll put up her name here. And and her picture, so just I'll put up her name and her picture. But she was among them, and she grew her locks too, and others, you know, as a sign of protest. So that introduced something, because that was a new hairstyle for people here, that wasn't, you know, just another way of people wore their natural hair, and it didn't involve much. It was freeform, just let it grow. Yeah. Oh, and also by the for the most part, but I also learned that doing small kind of dreads was also very common in the coast, among the coastal Bantu, and they used local materials. So I don't know if that goes into pre-colonial or early colonial, but oh my god, I forgot about that. But that also existed. Anyhow, so we'll just keep going. So in the colonial, we had almost done. Dreadlocks have entered the chart, kind of. The dreadlocks, the locks. And we also have the styling. People are just coming there. They've grown their hair and styled it, because they've interacted with people from other cultures. They've gone to school. They've seen the white women style their hair. They've also tried to style theirs. They've tied them, you know, the headscarves. Yeah, they are copying the Nubians. So, but dreadlocks have entered the chart. Then we go into the 60s. We are ending. The British rule is ending. Early 60s. We are going into our own, into self-rule, self-determination, and around the same time, still the styles were still, you know, more or less the same. They had still, you know, what was trending in like London, wherever, for the ladies. So the ladies at school were also copying that. But then you go into the 60s, late 60s, where, you know, now we can start interacting. There was Pan-Africanism, there was the big Afro thing just coming in, and, you know, people start also, these movements are all over the world, in other parts. People are traveling, you know, bringing influences, magazines here and there. So people are doing the afros, doing the vitambas, the stylish headscarves. But now the afros have entered. The big afro has entered the church. Just comment, it's a massive afro. Everybody wanted an afro. Men, women, everybody. If you look at pictures from them days, if you ask your relatives to give you old pictures, I have old pictures of my grandpa with the biggest, my bald grandpa, who's been bald since I have known that man, with the biggest, juiciest afro. That is why I hope I can even reach that afro. Biggest, my grandma too, everybody. These are my parents. So you can see it was a whole thing. It was major. Everybody, you know, the afro was a point of pride. That was the decade of the afro, the 60s, the 70s, with the afros and the, you know, the very Afrocentric hairstyles. At that time, in the 70s, as you're going towards, I feel like in the 70s, that's where the heat, the processing. So the afros in the 60s were just put afro and go your way. There wasn't too much processing or anything. Just comb, find a way, comb your hair, you know. And maybe the things, the people went to products. My grandfather told me you just comb and use hair pomades, you know, just mafuta of any kind, of just comb, and it was, you know. And my grandmother used to also have this. But I think I have my grandma's hair, but it looked a lot like my hair, you know, just when I tried to afro it. But they use any oils. I think the people at the coast would have always had coconut oil, would use coconut oil on theirs. And, you know, but then by the 60s, but then something I forgot to mention is that during the colonial period, the use of animal products like the fat from sheep, the oil, the ghee, the what, kind of just fell off as we moved into, as we became more of a colony and eventually moved on to our independence. Like that whole season, during somewhere there, the use of animal products for hair care disappeared, and even the use of traditional methods, except maybe at the coast where people kept on using the coconut oil, but everybody else just didn't. Just moved on to other things. So there were pomades. I've seen adverts of pomades like really long ago in the 70s or something like that. I saw, okay, I think it was 80s, but they just combed their hairs in brains. And then we move on to the 70s and 80s, where again so much changed, because around that decade, at least in Kenya, that's when people started processing their hair. Now they didn't process it chemically at the time. And in the 70s, the heat, in the late 60s, early 70s, people started using hot combs to comb the hair and to force the hair to be straight, to make the hair straighter. So before, people would style the hair just raw, the way it is, virgin afros or virgin African hair, even when they wore into other styles. But as they go into the 70s, the styles are more about it. And I feel like it's the same with like other countries. When I read their history of hair, I also notice even for other people from other races with different hair types, it was big. That decade was big on heat, teasing, making hair do things using heat. And so there was the hot combs where you'd have to put it in a fire and use it to straighten your hair. And also people would now improvise and use pieces of ceramic, what is it, pieces of pots. Someone told me, I can't remember, an aunt or my aunt, may she rest in peace, she told me people used to use broken shards of pots and heat them and then use them to straighten their hair, and it would work. And they use them, but then the same, because even a hot iron, a curling iron, is made from ceramic, you know. Oh my god, I hadn't even noticed that, but hey, it used to work. She saw it used to work, and you'd have to oil it and then use the ceramic, or people would even use tin cans, which were, they made holes. I'll look for pictures and put them up here. Tin cans, and they use those to blow dry their hair, to straighten their hair, to straighten their hair, to straighten like this. And those are common hairstyling tools. Tins that have holes, cups, these enamel cups with holes, anything hot that you can heat, that can withstand the heat, and then you can use it to apply and make your hair long and straighten, I mean, sorry. Of course, there was a lot of heat damage at the time, because it was actually something. My same auntie who told me this thing told me that hair would typically break off. So you'd have your style, but then after some time, your hair would break off. And there was, so the hot combs, all sorts of things were used to straighten the hair with heat. That was in the 70s. Now come the 80s, and we have something called relaxers. I don't know, I haven't seen this evidence of relaxers in the 70s, but I've said, oh, maybe there were, because there was but at least in Kenya it wasn't like it hadn't taken root, but in the 80s it definitely took root, and it was the curly perm, it was called curly kit. Curly kit, again I'll put up pictures, very popular in the 80s. Anybody who wanted to care for their hair to look nice, so the natural hair was processed, and that is how the style was now. The style was curly kit. So it wasn't a very good decade for natural hair. Neither were the 70s. It's like the last good time was 60s, when people just left it alone and styled it that way. But in the 70s and 80s, oh my gosh, so first the heat, all sorts of things, then the curly perm. With a very wet curly perm. You just see them. I have pictures of my mother and my aunties, and they have curls, very wet curls that are just sticking to their face. But they were hot at the time. They were the buddies. They were the buddies. So there was that style. There was that season, that period of the curly perm. But the relaxer had entered the chart now, and was very active. You know, dreadlocks entered the chart in the 50s or 40s, but were very quiet. Dreadlocks, relaxers entered the chart and were noisy. Everybody who was somebody who could do something had relaxers. It wasn't just here, even black people in other areas, but we're just talking about Kenya. So relaxers were hot everywhere. The relaxers had entered the chart in the 80s, but towards the end of the 80s, something else had entered the chart, which was braids, braided hair extensions, like braiding hair, what we call piece or braids now. That came through, and the braided hair extensions that could be added on natural hair to have longer, longer plaits, longer styles. And the main style was just loose braids. And it had entered in the 80s, and how I know this, somewhere in the 80s, how I know this, and if I'm wrong, if it's in the the 70s or when, that's okay, but it had entered in the 80s. How I know this because the Angel Hair Company and Darling opened shop around 89, 90s. So there must have been already a need for the factory to just come and now start producing the materials needed to work for that, to make that hairstyle. So we have the braids somewhere in the 80s, 90s maybe. Again, not a complete authority on this. If you have any extra information or you know something, you can just comment over there, and I'll be really grateful. And I'll share it too at update. So we have the braids coming in, so natural hair. So it wasn't, I already said the 80s wasn't a very good decade also because for natural hair, because the relaxer came in, but the braids also came in, so you could keep your hair natural, or grow, you could plait your short, very short hair and have long loose braids. Then we go into the 90s. Now these are the styles that ruled the 90s. These were the braids. The style from the decade before the 80s, the curly, the palms, the curly one, the straight palm, and then the braidings, the braid styles, the fashions, just the different braids. Yeah, the afros, not too much, and of course by then also wigs had already warmed their way somewhere, maybe from the 60s or 70s. Wigs had entered the chart somewhere in there, so but the natural hair mainly those ones, and of course, yeah, and along in there, people were doing wigs, they were still doing the plaits, they were still doing the braids from the Nubians. But now the style, the landscape, then the natural hair care had moved so far from just at the beginning of the century. 100 years in, 90 years later, it was just completely different. Those traditional styles, the keeping very short hair, was not so common anymore. People are trying to grow their hair or style it in a lot of different ways, except maybe for some schools that were still very strict. But for the most part, women were growing hair, and the men who used to keep long hair, the Morans, in some specific areas, but for the most part, men kept their hair short. 90 years later, men kept their hair short, women grew their hair and, looked after it. Again, the hair care products would be the pomades, the relaxer sets, and that kind of thing. The relaxer sets, the braiding hair. Pomade is what we call mafuta ya nywele, mafuta ngumu. There are so many versions. You'll see old magazine adverts that have a lot of pomades and hair from back then, and oils even, for both men and women. Then we move, so there's hot comb might have, now the people didn't really need to hot comb their hair, they could process it with a relaxer, so the people moved a little bit away from the hot combs. Yeah. Then in the 2000s is when people started, from 2000 going on, people noticed that is the decade when something called the curly, in the 2000s, the curly palm kind of almost phased out, and we had more people doing the straight palm, and so many styles around it. The relaxer, so natural hair, the people that could afford to do like go salons, they really went for the relaxers. The relaxers took root in this country. I think that was the golden age of the relaxer, the 2000s, and a lot more different varieties of braids and hair pieces, and just hair extensions that you could attach to your hair. And there was also this movement of the blow dry, the straightening hair with heat to within an inch of its life, which is what we call blow dry, because here we never, I think that's where the root of this kind of blow dry that's actually heat damage came from, where people started using heat to just make their hair behave the same as a straight palm, but it's still natural. I feel like it was a cost issue, like people who couldn't afford a straight palm could just use a blow dryer, could just have the hair blow dry. It was much cheaper, but again, I stand to be corrected if you know any other theory. That's just my theory. It was probably cheaper, it was a lot cheaper in the 2000s going on to, yeah, so it was, but mainly straight hair was the thing. And around somewhere in the 90s, the dreadlocks that had entered the chart and kept quiet started being active, small. People started wearing them out, dreadlock as a hairstyle. There was maybe it could have been the late 80s, but in the 90s there were people here and there. You can see some evidence of dreadlocks joining the chart, where people are growing them as a hairstyle, looking after them, styling products existed. So by, or maybe late 90s, because by 2000s dreadlocks were a look. There were people that specialized in doing them, in setting, installing them, and that kind of thing. There were salons, there were stylists, at least. I'm not so sure about salons, but stylists who were established, and that's who created that, like who established themselves as lock stylists. They did store, they look, you know. So they came in. So we had the lock. Natural hair was mainly represented in locks, and that hit damaged blow dry. That are also popular back then. And then we move on through the 2000s into the, what is that period from 2010? After 2010, what do they call the 20 what? That season, 2010, that other decade. Now there also was really good for them. So the relaxers had a good time between the 80s, 90s, and to the 90s and 2000s. Now in the 2000s, from 2010s, and with the advent of social media, natural and dreadlocks had started coming up, growing, were being the locks. All of a sudden, in the social media comes on, and the Facebooks, and groups start rising, and people start talking about natural hair and how they care for it, and there was all this information shared, and natural hair found a revival. Like the afros. People started wanting afros again and wanting to just see how their hair looks without, heat, without the relaxers, Personally, I was invited to join a natural hair group in 2012. I did not join. I barely used to have. I was still in school. I was very, oh my God, I used to see my Facebook once in months. So I didn't join. And it was a lady I knew who had grown out her hair for some years, obviously, so she must have been in it for a while. She's the one who taught me, she's the one who introduced me to natural hair groups, and so but the movement was already there, I suppose. I didn't join until 2015, I think, but I didn't properly, I wasn't even active, I didn't even read anything, but I remember looking and admiring her hair in 2012. Yeah, because I just joined Facebook. When I just joined Facebook at the time, so this is what that is when natural hair movement, now as we know it, became a whole thing where Kenyan women wanted to explore the natural hair again, but now in a different way, like in a more radical way, where they didn't want heat. They wanted to just see what their hair looks like, and that's when the natural hair movement, I feel like the 70s was when it happened, but people just didn't sit and call it a movement. But in 2012, maybe after 2010 at least, somewhere there along that decade, something around then, people decided, oh, we're going to start looking after our hair this way. And so the hair care practices were, the women, the people, the Kenyan women who are interested in looking after the natural hair were ahead of everybody. It just seemed to happen overnight. So even the companies that produce hair care products were not ready. They were still producing products that are ideal for relax, for the other styles. So it was a bit of but since then there's been a lot of growth and change in that way. We have a lot of natural hair products that are ideal for looking after natural hair, for caring for natural hair, for the hair types that are common in Kenya, for caring for locks, for caring for loose, just afro, natural curl or plaited style. We have salons now, so it's really, we're really on course. There's salons, there's so many stylists, there are so many schools that have opened up to accepting certain other hairstyles, workplaces. So we've really come a long way. But in a nutshell, that's a very big nutshell. But in short, that's where natural hair care started for Kenyans, and this is where we are right now. And I hope that this is, helpful or was interesting somewhat to you. And if you have any other information that I missed or somewhere you found out wrong and you have new info, you can just comment with it, and I'll be very happy. And also please subscribe, please subscribe. Every subscriber matters. Thank you so much for everybody that has already subscribed. Until next time, bye.